Okay, so good evening, everybody. Can you hear me in the back, Luba? Good. My name is Laurel McDonald, and I'm director of the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. And it's my great honor and great pleasure to welcome you to the 23rd Annual Alexander C. Pathy Lecture on the Book Arts. To begin, however, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the U of T operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga, and today it's home to many Indigenous and Métis people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful for the opportunity to work on it. So welcome everybody to the Alexander Pathy Lecture on the Book Arts. It's so exciting to see all of you here in person. This is our first lecture in person since 2020, and it's actually a hybrid lecture, so this is actually being recorded live and will be online as well. So it's just very lovely to have people in the room and also online as well. And it's a great honor to have somebody very special in the room, and that's actually Dr. Alexander Pathy, Professor Emeritus. In addition to his academic career, Dr. Pathy was also the Vice President at the U of T of Human Resources and of Business Affairs as well. And in fact, as a university archivist, one of the earliest collections I brought in, Alec, was actually your vice presidential records, which are now actually upstairs in the archives. Dr. Pathy has actually been a wonderful supporter of the U of T libraries. For example, he served as an advisor for the library on the Boundless campaign. For us here in the Fisher, we're especially grateful to him for supporting this wonderful lecture series for now 23 years. So thank you, Alex, so much. And I'm also delighted that we have a very special guest lecture, and this is after, I believe, Andrew, the fourth attempt to have you come speak to us due to various issues, including COVID. So we're extremely excited to have Dr. Andrew Pettegree, who is a professor of modern history at the University of St. Andrews. He's also published over a dozen books now, including The Book in the Renaissance, The History of the Library, A Fragile History, I believe, as well as The Invention of News. Andrew is also the founding director of the St. Andrews Reformation Studies Institute as well. And in recent years, his research has involved into studying the history of communications and in particular the history of the book. And we're incredibly delighted to have Dr. Pettegree here this evening, finally, to discuss the book at war. So without further ado, enough of me and on to Dr. Pettegree. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for those kind words, and thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm very pleased to be here at the fourth time of trying. I've been coming to Toronto since 1976, when I first came over to go to the Montreal Olympics and promptly caught chicken pox and watched it on the television. Well, the genesis of the book I'm going to talk about today occurred appropriately enough on a visit to the Imperial War Museum. I'd gone to see an exhibition on the conservation of art during the Second World War, and it was an excellent show focused on the Imperial War Museum's own collection and also that of the National Gallery. But I found myself asking, what about the books? What happened to them? And it's certainly the case that the plunder and restitution of art, particularly by the Nazi regime, has received hugely more attention than the impact of the war on the continent's books. Now, obviously, this was a subject that we had to address when we wrote the library, A Fragile History, and that's the UK edition on the left, showing the Library of Cincinnati, and this is the US edition showing the Library of Dublin. So there is a certain perversity in that. But the library at Cincinnati is now a car park, which is why we wanted that image, because showing the fragility. But really, in a book trying to tell the history of libraries from the beginning to now, there wasn't space to do this subject justice, which is why it seemed to me it was worth a book of its own. Now, researching this book, Arthur and I became aware there was a fairly settled narrative of the book in wartime. That is, of the book as the mute, innocent victim of armed conflict. And certainly total war, the mutation of war from the battlefield to the home front, has had its enormous impact on books and library stock. As the bombs rained down, books were inevitably collateral damage in London and Coventry, in France, Poland, and ultimately during the obliteration of the German cities. And this is the Berlin State Library at the end of the war. But there is more to it than this. Books were not only collateral damage, they were deliberately targeted as the Nazis attempted to erase the culture of Poland and Judaism. And sadly, this destruction of books as an aspect of genocide did not end with the Second World War. In 1941, a Sinhalese crowd destroyed Jaffna Public Library. This is before, and this is after, the principal depository of Tamil culture. And in 1992, the National University of Bosnia in Sarajevo was deliberately targeted by Serbian artillery. And we can trace this deliberate targeting of archives and library stock all the way back to the Reformation and the 30 Years' War. In his book, The Destruction of Books, Richard Ovenden makes much of the burning of the Library of Congress by British troops in 1914. What he pays less attention to is that this was in fact a reprisal for the looting of York, now Toronto Library, by American troops in 1813. I hope you've not forgiven that. Through all of this, there is an underlying assumption that books were innocent victims. We assume that libraries and books are inherently a force for good. You would not be members of the Friends of this institution if you did not think that. And we see this today when hard-pressed local authorities consider downsizing their libraries to be met with a chorus of lamentation from people like us, even if we don't make much use of public libraries ourselves. So we all know that books and libraries are a force for good, except when they are not. It's sobering to remember that two of the greatest supporters of the public library in the 20th century were Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. In 1934, Germany had 9,000 libraries. By 1940, the number had risen to 13,000, and they filled the shelves with a different sort of book. And even in the democracies, were books ever the mute, innocent victims of the canonical destruction narrative? Here I would like to quote Archibald MacLeith, Librarian of Congress and a leading proponent of the US joining the Second World War. War, he said, modern war at least, cannot be fought without the most complete library resources. No library resources can ever be too complete for the necessities of a great industrial state engaged in a law which involves all its facilities, all its manpower, and all its knowledge. And he made the point that America found itself involved in a war, the Pacific War, about numerous countries about which it knew very little. Franklin D. Roosevelt put the matter more succinctly. Books are weapons in the war of ideas, and had been, indeed, since the beginning of printing. The 16th century Paris printer, Nicolas Cheneau, had got there before Roosevelt. As he remarked in a preface to one of his works, pamphlets are weapons in a spiritual war. And it's the activism of print that I want to stress today. In this book, which I'm in the process of finishing, I trace the relationship between print and warfare from the rush of military handbooks in the first age of print and the foundation of military academies to the beginning of scientific warfare. We examine boys' magazines for the ideologies that saw men flock to the front in 1914, and we visit the scientists' laboratories and the academics who became spymasters to see how academic libraries, like indeed this one, contributed to the war machine. So I want to introduce two themes. First, the idea of books as the munitions of war, and then we'll turn in the second half to look at how books provided comfort and solace for the fighting people, both in the front and at home. So this is how it looks. This is the first third of the book, where we look firstly at the art of war and then at why men fight. As long as there's been writing, men have written on the art and science of war. The sacred texts of Judaism, canonized as the Old Testament, are suffused with the clash of civilizations as the people of Israel fought to establish their claim to a domicile. Sieges, massacres, and pitched battles punctuate the narrative. Certainly, no one could come away from reading the Old Testament believing that waging war was inherently immoral. And it flourished with print. As many of you may know, I'm the curator of a bibliographical tool which examines all books printed in the first age of print, and we classify them by subject. And the Universal Short Title Catalogue already lists 2,071 military handbooks, books about the waging of war. And that's it just before 1650. Now, these books were intended for self-education. They were intended for officers who wanted to improve their grasp of military strategy. And it was really only at in the 19th century that we see the beginnings of formal military education, following on the great success of Napoleon, who became the archetype of the successful military strategist, followed by his friend and memorialist, Jomini. Now, because of Napoleon's successes, French became an obligatory subject even for the unlucky students of West Point. And this is their first printed catalogue, and you see, just going down, just how many books were in French. And this is absolute torture for a young man like Stonewall Jackson, a country boy, one of the great instinctive strategists of the American Civil War, but a man who arrived at West Point with little formal education. Now, what the 19th century teaches us, that there was always a danger of fighting the last war. And in the case of Napoleon, the last war but 5, because it was only really when the Germans had these shattering defeats of Denmark, then Austria, and then France, that people began to take German strategy seriously. Why men fight? Now, this is an important subject which has received a lot of attention recently for their comrades to end the war and get home because they believe in the cause. And it's particularly striking that in 1914, after many decades of muted warfare between European powers, millions in each of the protagonist nations cheerfully flocked to the front. And I think to understand it, we have to delve a long way back to the sort of literature that was being read by boys and young men and which shaped their attitudes to their own country and potential enemies. Now, in 1912, Lord Northcliffe made a striking declaration of the contribution he believed his boys' papers made in building martial spirit. And this is what he said. These journals aimed from the first at the encouragement of physical strength, of patriotism, in interest in travel, and exploration of pride in our empire. It has been said that the boys' papers of the amalgamated press have done more to provide recruits for our Navy and Army and to keep up the esteem of our sister services than everything else. Well, it's worth remembering at this point that the Boys' Own paper was actually not one of Northcliffe's papers for the young, but published by the Religious Tract Society. As this rather unlikely publisher might suggest, this was another attempt to wean the nation's youth off low-grade, gory thrillers, the penny dreadfuls and tuppenny bloods. The Boys' Own paper succeeded because it managed to square the circle of securing the approval of headmasters and parents without repelling its intended readers, the boys. And crucially, it was also thought fit for the public library. And this was the first age of the public libraries from about the 1880s onwards. And there they could find the Boys' Own paper as well. Now, the rise of imperialism owed a very, very great deal to papers of these sorts. And we can see a blending of different modes of communication at the end of the century in the Boer War. Now, the Boer War was a war in South Africa against the Afrikaner inhabitants of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, and it was a war the British government did not want to fight. And yet they were bounced into it by the various media that worked to popularize this rather hopeless conflict. And this included a young man named Winston Churchill, who already had 2 well-received books to his name in his early war service. He went down to fight the Boer War as a war correspondent for the Morning Post. And he made his own contribution to the drama by escaping from a Boer prisoner of war camp, a daring escapade that attracted huge popularity at home and helped launch his parliamentary career. What is most striking, I think, in the literature of this period is the cross-fertilization and synergy between the newspapers, the periodicals, and the long-form book. And as a historian of ephemera, I tend to regard anything that is printed as a book, anything that is printed with movable type. Books were developed from articles in the newspapers or serialized in magazines. Authors wrote commissioned articles for the papers. Newspapers, in return, promoted authors through reviews and commissions. And this lucrative exchange would continue in the febrile period leading up to the First World War, when newspapers played an ever more influential role in shaping public opinion. And it's very interesting when some of the young lads who went along to the recruiting stations in 1914 were asked, why have you done this? And one response is particularly important to this study, and he said, well, I read the same magazines as all the other boys, and now I'm here. Now, the Germans were thought of as leaders in military education, but they too looked on the English public school system with envy. This led to the establishment of a series of boarding schools to train the new Nazi elite, and they were known as the Napoli schools. You can see this rather posed photo here. They're all delving into the newspapers very diligently. Hitler intended, through institutions like this, to dominate the lives of young Germans inside and outside the classroom from the age of 10 into adulthood. They will never again be free throughout their whole lives, is what he intended. And to a large extent, it worked. And I've paired this photo with a book from my own collection on the sins of the British Empire as seen through philately. And if you open up this book, you find each page has a part of the British Empire with a little tract about how badly Britain behaved in order to get hold of these properties. So even stamp collectors are not free from this ideological barrage. Let's turn to science. In July 1945, Luther Evans, Archibald Macleish, successor as Librarian of Congress, reflected on these contributions to science in the war effort. He says, "I'm allowing myself no poetic license whatsoever when I say that matters of large importance, battles won or lost, programs of action misdirected or well-directed, are affected by the presence or absence in the libraries of the nation of books, government documents, scientific periodicals, and other forms of publication." Now, this was, for me, a very frustrating chapter to research, because scientists say very little about books when they're writing about their work. But what, of course, they were using was not so much books as periodicals. And here, the war effects a complete change between the pre-war situation, where the free flow of information across nations is axiomatic for scientists, to the importance of keeping secrets from your enemy. There's one moment when a scientist goes into his local university library to catch up on the latest articles on nuclear fission, of which there had been very many, and he noticed that the British and American periodicals had none at all. That is, what had been commonly shared information was now a military secret. Now, I just want to pair this remark with a similar remark made by a lecturer at the Technological University in Berlin, speaking on science in the struggle for the Reich and living space. And he comes to the same conclusion in the more robust phraseology of totalitarianism. War is and always was the historic test of peoples. This is also true for science and scientists. Their values to their own people and their ranking within their own people is determined in an uncompromising way only by war. For them as well, war is the only judge. So scientists must become warriors. Now, the most important academics in many ways during the war were the geographers. Geography became a university subject in Germany very early, and of course, borders, as Lord Curzon put it, are the razor's edge on which hangs suspended the issue of war or peace and the life of nations. And I suppose Canada, like the United Kingdom, can take comfort in the fact that our borders are actually not so very controversial. But if you look at the mess of Central Europe, that's by no means the case. I put this in because this is a marvelous painting of a French schoolroom. And you see the schoolmaster is pointing to Alsace-Lorraine, which switches back and forth between Germany and France. And here he's pointing out to them that the Alsace-Lorraine has been blackened out on the map of France because it is now possessed by Germany. Well, that came to an end at the end of the First World War. The irony of the First World War was that the most famous of all applications of strategic geography, that is the Schlieffen Plan, led to 4 years of virtual immobility and brought a new sort of map making, and that was trench maps. 4 years of troglodyte life dueling over acres of mud. And I think the Ordnance Survey published over 32 million copies of these detailed maps of trench fortifications. Now, in cartographical terms, the Second World War really begins in the Palace of Versailles in 1919. The German political leadership, already in some disarray, was caught unawares by the decision to exclude them from negotiations. And they were quick to lay out the case for cartographic revisionism. In 1921, they in effect proposed that the new boundaries of Germany after 1918 should not be recognized in the German school system. And here's what they said. The Convention of German Geographers proclaims that it is a national necessity and duty that the link to Germandom of the areas which were torn from the German Empire in the Treaty of Versailles, including the colonies, remain clearly visible in atlases and maps, and advocates that only those works for which this is the case be used for instruction in all school grades. And these were not mere words. For the next 20 years, German geographers kept up a ceaseless barrage, advocating the return of territory lost in 1919 and making the case for further eastward expansion. And this occurred, I want to emphasize, long before the Nazi takeover. This is one where the academics needed no converting to the nationalist cause. They believed in Lebensraum long before Hitler. Indeed, academic geographers caused problems for the Nazi regime only when an abundance of enthusiasm offered a potential source of embarrassment. Shortly after the Nazis came to power, the authorities moved to suppress a 1932 text that delineated a desirable frontier line which was deep into French territory. And you can see here that Greater Germany seems to encompass not only the entire Low Countries, but parts of northern France as well. Well, in the event, the deeds of the Wehrmacht would actually render much of this redundant, because it took them much further than even the greatest hopes of the able geographers. Well, so we see in science, we see in intelligence, where it's the intelligence operations are the opportunities for the humanists, that is historians and classicists, to get in on the war game. And then in cartography, we see how the resources of the whole nation are being turned towards total war. In my second section, the middle section of this book, we deal with issues of how this impacts on war and how war impacts on books. The printing industry, reading in warfare, censorship, and then books for the troops, what happens to authors during the war, and a very special category of reader, which is prisoners of war. As for publishing faced real issues during the wartime, particularly on the continent of Europe. The situation in Canada and the United States is rather different. Paper was hard to get hold of and strictly rationed. And worse, for publishers, even if they weren't going to get bombed, they had to deal with one other existential threat, and that is that the government started publishing itself and became a competitor. And I brought today to show you one of the rather marvelous books that the book's put. This is called Combined Operations. And I bought this copy because I read a war diary where a minister is going across Lincolnshire, and he finds that every other inhabitant of his carriage is reading this book, which was bought for 2 shillings. On the other side, everything sold, because publishers could not get all that much all that much paper. Just about everything they published would sell. So the risk was taken out of the game. And of course, this is the first age of the paperback. I've got a couple of wartime paperbacks here. A Little Penguin, 1945, a grubby little thing, and one published in the United States, which is absolutely of tremendous quality. And you should look at the two together, because that demonstrates actually why digital resources will never be a surrogate for just holding a book in your hand and being able to just feel it. What about censorship then? Here the contrast between the democracies and the totalitarian states is actually less extreme than one might imagine. Because although Stalin and Hitler controlled authorship much more clearly, actually paper rationing put a tremendous amount of discipline into the publishing industry in the UK, for instance. The application of the censorship regulations, even in neutral countries like Ireland, actually introduce a few elements of low farce into this story. None more absurd than the fate of W.E. Johns' Wardlaw of the Waff. Have any of you read the Biggles stories? Yeah? The part of your life? Well, this was his female heroine. When war broke out in 1939, President Eamon de Valera of Ireland faced a very difficult balancing act because he knew that quite a number of his supporters were actually pretty pro-German. So he put them in charge of, there's combined operations. That's the Blitz, another posed photo, as you can see. The boy just enjoying a bit of reading in a bombed-out bookshop. And here's Wardlaw of the Waff. And on the other side, we see Frank Aitken, who became in charge of censorship. Now, this in Ireland was not a negligible role, because respecting the Catholic origins of the state, Ireland issued regular lists of books forbidden to be imported into the country, either because they were, quote, in their general tendency indecent, or because they advocate the unnatural prevention of conception. Now, most well-known British publishers at some point fell afoul of these regulations. And it must be said that Frank Aitken fulfilled his responsibilities with commendable thoroughness, even to the extent of demanding to see proofs of the book reviews of the Irish Times. And hundreds of them that were turned down, including the review of Wardlaw of the Waff. So the pro-British editor, R.M. Smiley, bided his time before resubmitting the same review, but now under the title Lottie of the Luftwaffe. And this sailed through censorship without a problem. And so he could then raise a real stushy about the pro-German sentiment of the Censor's Office. I want to come quickly on to books for the troops. Books for the troops starts in the First World War with these book drives, assembling huge numbers of books, which were then sent off to camp libraries and then hopefully off into the front line. It was well-meaning, but often the books given for these purposes were not exactly what the troops wanted to read. And so a much more successful way of dealing with this issue was to print books specially for the troops. Penguin did this with special troops editions, and also the most important and most effective of these initiatives. These are some of the wartime penguins I have. And as you see, Penguin eventually gets challenged by the other publishers with these guild editions. And you see one of them is actually called a services edition as well. I put a passage to India up because it was actually printed in Egypt. So they set up a printing press closer to the troops. But by far the most important of these initiatives was the armed service editions printed by the Americans, as you see, in this very, very unusual format. And this was intended to just fit in the leg pocket, and so it can be carried about. It's in 2 columns for ease of reading, and it was a tremendous success. And you see how it was printed was they would set up 2 books on the same page, which therefore had to have the same number of pages, and then it would be guillotined and separated. and something like 180 million of these were delivered free to American troops in their stations throughout the war. So I've brought this one. They're quite difficult to get hold of now because, of course, they were just abandoned at the end of the war, or indeed, as you can see from these, just used to death. I want now to pass on to the matter of authors. War is always tough for authors. Should they sign up and fight? Many did. Others simply found they had nothing to say when the future of the whole world was at stake. Or should the writer offer their services to the war effort? Hilary St. George Saunders, who wrote several runaway bestsellers for the Ministry of Information in this series, would argue trenchantly that, quote, in time of war, writers and publishers, like everyone else, have the duty of putting such skills and talents as they possess at the service of their country for an agreed wage. And no writer worthy of the name would seek to become a bestseller by describing deeds in which he took no part. In other words, what people wanted to hear from was the fighting men themselves. And that's true. Books by pilots or people who had fought in France in 1940 were incredibly popular. This war, the Second World War, was particularly hard for female authors. The disappearance of the literary journals and many women's magazines cut off a number of avenues for placing their work, while the disappearance of domestic servants to war work meant that time previously spent on writing was now occupied with cooking, queuing, and running the household. In February 1944, Eustace Frost at Penguin received a harrowing appeal from one of her authors, Kathleen Hale, author of Orlando's Evening Out. This is their first original novel for children, published in Penguin's Puffin strand. I'm wondering if you will be sending me a statement of royalties soon. I can tell you why I'm worrying about this. Domestic servants can command a much higher wage than hitherto, and I'm in danger of losing mine if I don't give her a rise very soon. I can't do this until I get my royalties, for my husband's salary is, like everyone's else, halved by the increased income tax, and he can't help me. I want to be able to say to my maid that on a certain day I will raise her wages. If I lose her, there will be no more books from me, because I can't possibly do without her. So a cheque was paid, and there were 4 more books between 1942 and 1946. But the war did at least play an important role in easing into life, one of the great novels of the 20th century. And this is quite a strange story, because Evelyn Waugh joined the commandos, I think, with great enthusiasm, but he was just a terrible soldier. He was hated by his men. He was self-indulgent and ill-disciplined. And in the end, in January 1944, he realized he wasn't up to it. So he wrote to his commanding officer requesting 3 months' leave without pay to write a new novel. And thus began a dance with authority which lasted for half a year, because on the one hand the army didn't want to reward Waugh for being so obstreperous, but on the other they realized that anything that he was involved in was likely to be less effective. So he was given some weeks' work, then he was recalled, then he was sent to another commanding officer who gave him more time off to get rid of him, and eventually what came out of this was Brideshead Revisited, which was a runaway bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic. But I want to turn actually also to prisoners of war, because these are so interesting. Publishers like nothing more than a captive audience, and this is the ultimate captive audience. One officer records in his diary reading 350 books in his time incarcerated. And Penguin tried a special service, as you see, the Prisoners of War book service, where they would subscribe and get these titles. Unfortunately, they made a tactical error, because they included in one of these books this advertisement, which is really made for home distribution, which shows a soldier poking his bayonet up Adolf Hitler's backside. And when this was revealed, this resulted in the banning of all Penguin books from prisoner of war camps. Now, when I was at the York Fair this year, I came across this, Christianity in the Social Order by William Temple. And I was drawn to it because I thought, this is interesting. Why is the Archbishop of Canterbury being published as you see in Penguin, New York, rather than the UK? And particularly interesting for this audience is it's also being printed in Toronto. Now that is a sore point for Britons, because one of the things they worried about, that the United States, with its access to decent paper, I mean this is of a different quality altogether in terms of paper, would just steal all the British markets outside Europe, and they certainly completely took over the Canadian market in a way which has never really changed. But what's interesting about this has a whole number of stamps on it. And this is just fascinating, because one of the things about the prisoner of war books is they don't survive. In 1945, they were simply abandoned by their owners, not least because most of the prisoners were marched out of the camps into the winter and away from the front. So they left behind 3 or 4 million books, copies of books, but they were all pretty degraded by then. So what do we have here? We have an indication that the YMCA in Geneva has received this book, and then that it has reached its camp, which is a Polish officers' camp in Bavaria. We see that it was censored before it was sent off, to see that it was giving away no war secrets. It would be very strange indeed if the Archbishop of Canterbury's book had been rejected by the American or British Soviet, and it was received, and here it is. It's in Oflag 7A and in the Polish Evangelical Library. So all is well, except when we see on the next page, unzulässig, forbidden. So at the last minute, this book, which I have in my hands, was rejected. And why was it rejected? It was rejected because the censor was doing his job. And that is, he read that William Temple was posing the question, what right has the church to interfere in war? And his answer was, a very great deal of right. And he had Temple was a hardliner. He had no sympathy whatsoever for pacifism, no sympathy for the Germans when they were being bombed. And so the censor was, in a way, quite right to have this book withdrawn. And that's what saved it, because this would have been taken to a hut where all the other forbidden material was. And when the American troops overran this camp, it was probably taken by one of the more pious of the American officers, and which is why eventually it's made its way into my hands and is probably one of the most precious books in my collection. So I won't go on at length about this. I'll just point out that what we do in part 3 of this book is we talk about chapter 13, about the attempts to send some of the most precious books away to sanctuary. Unfortunately, the Germans sent most of those to places in Silesia and the Czech Republic, which were then overwhelmed by the Russians, and they never got them back. We talk about plunder, both the wholesale plunder by the Nazi high command and the more deliberate plunder by the Allied troops as they went through Germany in 1945. There's a very nice remark by one of the commanding officers of the American troops when he writes, we are advancing as rapidly as plunder will allow, as looting will allow. And then the war itself, the bombing itself, this is a book in the St. Andrews University Library, and the Vatican was under a lot of pressure by this point for their failure to protest more loudly the Holocaust. And so they clearly made this book in an English edition, demonstrating all the good they'd done, providing sanctuary for rare books, and sent a copy to university libraries like our own. This here is the sorting center when the Americans set up this center in Frankfurt to try and return some of the looted books from that the Germans had collected, because they wanted to keep 1 million or 500,000 books on Bolshevism, socialism, and Judaism, so that they knew their enemies in the future. So ironically, the Germans both destroyed Jewish books and preserved them. And here they are. And you can see that many of them never got out of their crates. And it was from this depot that they returned. Finally, we look at the Cold War, what we try to describe as war as peace. And what one can say about that is that although the Russians undoubtedly won the spying war during the Cold War, the Brits won the literary war. Because with John le Carré and Graham Greene, both of which were required reading for high officers in the KGB, and particularly with Ian Fleming and James Bond, which really seems to have got under the skin of the Russians, so much so that they encouraged the creation of a East German James Bond, a Bulgarian and a Hungarian equivalent, all of whom fought against James Bond and killed him many times over. It's actually rather sweet, because the East German is no Aston Martins and martinis for him. He just goes down the pub with his postman friend. We do have a little coda about 1989, and I would just want to end by reading out what Francis Fukuyama said in 1989 on his famous book, The End of History. And he said, "What we may have witnessed is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government." Well, he spent the last 30 years telling us what he really meant when he said that. And it's fun for me, because at almost that precise moment when he was laying out the end of history, my Oxford tutor was saying to me, I think well-meaning, that I would never write a book. And what he meant by that is, I think, that not that I was too stupid to write a book, I hope not anyway, but that the technology would mean that books would be redundant by the time I had anything to say. And yet, as we find, the opposite is the case. More books are printed every year and continue to be than ever before. And I think what he innocently committed was a fault of so much work on the history of communication, that they think that every innovation in the history of communication will eviscerate what went before. And whereas, in fact, the opposite is the truth. The history of communication is cumulative rather than sequential. By that I mean that when humans developed language, they didn't stop talking when they began writing. They didn't stop writing when they invented print. And they didn't stop reading books when digital came along. So I think if we readjust our understanding, we'll see why books will continue to play an important part in the history of our civilization, in war and in peace. Thank you very much.
We do have time for questions, so are there any questions? Oh, yeah.
It's a French painter from, I think, the 1880s.
Andrew, if you don't mind if we could repeat the
Sure.
question, if that's okay?
Sure.
Do you mind repeating the question?
The question referred to that very evocative painting of the school teacher showing the boy Alsace-Lorraine now in German hands. And I will find for you, if I may, the details of that. His name, the painter, was Albert Betanier. It's called The Geography Lesson, or The Black Spot, and it was painted in 1887. And ironically, it is now in the German Historical Museum in Berlin. Please, from the back.
Would you care to elaborate on your statement that Stalin and Hitler were the greatest book collectors of the 20th century?
Well, they were the greatest friends of the public library. The question was about Stalin and Hitler's fondness for public libraries. Now, what I would say is they came at this from different directions. Stalin was following in the footsteps of Lenin, who even in 1917 said that there had to be a huge effort to develop a public library network in Russia, simply to drive up the levels of literacy. And that actually was one of the great success stories of the Soviet Union between 1517 and the beginning of the war, basically to hugely widen the circles of people who could read. As far as Hitler was concerned, he was in an entirely different position, because Germany was, of course, one of the most bookish countries and one of the most cultured. So for him, building a public library network was a matter not only of creating new buildings and new institutions, but also of completely changing the library stock. So, for instance, the books of Jewish authors were immediately removed, and they were substituted by what was a sort of conservative nationalist literature, and also political literature indicating why it was necessary to deal with Poland and why the Czechs posed a great threat to Germany, being so close to the major centers of population. So it was as an ideological tool that they both admired the public library network. What I would say, the other interesting thing is about the Second World War, is it's the first war in history, I think, to be fought between best-selling authors. Because Winston Churchill kept himself afloat in the 1930s by writing. And of course Hitler, with Mein Kampf, had a book which sold 9 million. It would be Churchill who won the Nobel Prize for Literature after the war, and of course both of them would ultimately be eclipsed by Mao Zedong, who wrote a book which sold 1 billion copies, the quotations known as the Little Red Book. And I can remember from my own days in boarding school that if you wrote a letter to the Chinese embassy, they would send you a free copy, which several of us did because it just seemed so naughty to be owning Mao's Little Red Book. And I've been reading about this. It's a wonderful story, and one of the ways they promoted it, it was originally intended for the Chinese army, not for the whole population. And one of the ways they promoted it was by setting these quotations to music. So they'd have quotation songs. and some of them are pretty gruesome.
One of the last slides that you showed was a scene of books in crates that had been accumulated by the Nazis. I wondered if you could say something about what happened to those.
Okay, well, let's find them. There they are.
Yes.
Well, what had happened was essentially the Nazi state is a state of conflicting jurisdictions and competing power bases, and this is what Hitler always intended. So all his lieutenants should be fighting with each other. And this extended to censorship, it extended to intelligence network, and it extended to book collecting. So while in Frankfurt they were trying to build a library for the study of Judaism, and that was the one which came closest to being affected. At the same time, the Gestapo were collecting a massive library, so was Himmler's service, and so was an attempt to build a new Nazi university in the south. So you've got all these people trying to collect books, and then as the war comes to the end, you have all these books crated back and crisscrossing Germany in the search for a safe haven. Well, that's not going to work because you have the Russians on one side and the Allies on the other. But something like 1 million or 2 million of these books show up in Frankfurt. Now, that's in the American zone. And one of the things about the post-war restitution is that the occupying powers have responsibility for the books which happen to find their way into their place. So these books may be books that have come from France and the Netherlands, looted, and then go to one of the other collections and then have come back on the escape route, or they may be books from Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, or wherever. So the first task is to discover if any of these crates contain books from one institution. And if they are then returned to them. But the institutional holdings are mixed in with hundreds of thousands of books from private libraries. So the American officers who are running this depot are trying to teach their German workers to recognize book plates and ex libris so that they can be then gathered together. But of course, many of the people whose books these are, their families no longer exist. They've all been killed. So very, very few of the personal collections will ever make their way back. But it is true that some of the institutional collections did, particularly those from France and the Netherlands. Although the ones which had gone east and ended up, let's say, in Minsk or Kiev, they were not sending them back to the West. They were using them as a substitute for the books they had lost. Often, Belarus lost 80% of its book stock. So you can understand why anything that came their way, they weren't for giving back.
As a follow-up, were there any rare books collected? We know that fine art, sculptures and so on were looted, and there's still considerable problems in some museums that purchased what appeared to be legitimate provenance of these things and were not legitimate at all.
Yeah.
What about rare books? I mean, we're in this amazing library. Were there any of those that found their way either into private collections like Goering's and others?
Well, Laurel and I were actually talking about this before because she was saying that they're coming from an archival background. She's used to things being unique. And the same is true of art. You know, each item has a unique identity, whereas many of these books may just be one of an edition of 1,500, and there's plenty of that still left. And I think that explains why there has been so little interest thus far in these books. But of course, in their own way, they're also unique because they're uniquely owned by an author. Now, were some of them rare? Yes. A lot of the plunder of early printed books had been achieved before the war by German librarians dealing with Jewish antiquarian dealers who were trying to sell up and get out and giving them a fraction of their real value. So it was a completely corrupt transaction, but because money changed hands, it couldn't be treated in the same way as plundered books. And a particularly egregious example of this came to light relatively recently in the library at Weimar, which was 2,000 almanacs, probably worth a very great deal. And the librarian gave the dealer, or the collector in this case, 1 Deutschmark for each book. And it was a huge coup for the library. And at a committee meeting, he was asked, how he achieved this, and he said, "Oh, because the owner was a Jew, of course." It was a dreadful thing. But that's, I think, much of the plunder of early printed books had been done before. On the other hand, if you look at the catalogue of the German State Library now, they have something like 700,000 books, which are noted as now in the library in St. Petersburg, now in the Library of Moscow, now in the Library of Krakow. And those are 16th century books, because anything that had been sent to let's say, a salt mine for preservation, which was now in Soviet-controlled territory, that went east and never came back.
Just a quick question. In the picture on the program, it shows the American soldier with crossbow. My guess is he's reading a testament. What would your guess be? It's small. Just very large.
Yes, it's not one of the servicemen editions. It's not one of these books. A great deal of Bibles were sent and New Testaments, often with extremely thin paper, which was just ideal for rolling cigarettes. And so that's how many of them ended up. And of course, books like this, on the whole, they wouldn't have been brought home. But this is a pose picture as well. I mean, the U.S. Army wasn't stupid, and it did realise that not every soldier wanted to read Scott Fitzgerald and Somerset Maugham. So they also sent out miniaturised versions of Time magazine, Picture Post and such like, but also comic books. And this was the great age of the American comic book. And it just so happens that, even before America entered the war, Superman was now, instead of dealing with evil in Gotham, he was now giving Hitler a good old going over. So the troops got a much greater range of reading material than would be suggested by the concentration on these books. Well, it's certainly not one of these. One of these.
I just wanted to follow up on the tracing of these books. I can't quite remember, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't UNESCO set up a service a few years ago to track this online? They would submit queries and so on.
Yeah. Well, a few years ago is the crucial thing, because there was a big debate immediately afterwards, and that was where were the unclaimable remnants of Jewish collections to go. And there were different voices. The problem was that at the point where this was first being discussed, Palestine was still a British mandate, and the British government had not reconciled itself to the creation of the State of Israel. Nevertheless, there were already in Palestine important Jewish libraries and institutions which were ready and willing to take these books. On the other hand, many voices in the American community thought that New York was the proper home for these books. So in the end, with that issue was solved by about 40% going to America, 40% going to Israel, and the remains being distributed. But that's a specific question. Now, in East Germany, there was no attempt to restore private collections to their owners. And indeed, they were still, into the last decade of the last century, they were still removing marks of ownership from books in their collection in order to obfuscate the fact that they were plundered. You're right to say that in the last 5 years or so, quite a lot of libraries have begun to put resources into the examination of their collections to see what they have in terms of looted books. I mean, this is not a cost-effective process. There was one example which came to light where it proved possible. What the State Library in Berlin is doing, when they get such a book, they're putting it on a register in the hope that enough people are reading the register that they might say, as happened in this one case, that they knew the granddaughter of the owner. And this was eventually presented to her. Not someone who spoke German, but someone who really valued having this sole connection with a murdered relative. But you can understand that in institutions which are always short of staff and short of resources, this is a penitential act rather than an economically prudent one.
I think we'll have two more one here and then finish with you.
My question about that, the geography lesson is an interesting, possibly political statement, but how much, with borders changing and whatnot, if you go back to the beginning of Gutenberg, and when maps were being made, how much are maps important today in showing the changes of boundaries and whatever else you may have to do?
Well, maps are inherently political and always have been. From the time when maps of the world were centered on Jerusalem to the point where the voyages of the European powers gave them an opportunity to sort of remap. But until the 19th century, there really there weren't the precision surveying tools to establish borders. You have to think of not so much of frontiers as border zones. In a lot of Europe, you would be on a journey, you might pass through several different jurisdictions, all keeping slightly different time without being aware that you were doing so. The idea of frontier posts doesn't really come into it at this stage. But yes, maps are enormously political. Witness the maps of this sort where the German geographers are sketching out a greater Germany long before it comes about. And at Versailles, it was largely an exercise in map making, the Versailles peace. And apparently, President Wilson much enjoyed his role as the sort of world's cartographer-in-chief and would sort of crawl around on the drawing room, sort of deciding where frontiers would go. But of course, it doesn't work because all of the peoples don't live tidily in a confined space, and most European nations or peoples have had a moment of enormous success and tragic times when they're very limited. And one of the most sort of awful parts of the evisceration of Czechoslovakia before the war was that not only Germany came to take the Sudetenland, but all the other neighbors nipped in and took a few kilometers as well. No solidarity there. Peter.
The book you showed us, the oblong-bound book for the American troops, particularly uniform book. Do you happen to know if that's the same size as ace doubles? Do you know ace doubles?
No, tell me.
They're small paperbacks but bound in the traditional way round.
Yeah.
Each consists of 2 short novels, usually by the same author. A lot of them are science fiction, some are detective novels, some are western. Science fiction, I think, outnumbers the rest. But they're printed dos a dos. So you read one, if you read from one end of the book, you go into the middle, and then you turn it over and start. You read the other story.
Yeah.
I think they may be the same size as that. I've got a couple at home. Would you like them?
I would, but I mean, tell me what's the point of the flip? It doesn't have a particular logic to me.
You get 2 stories for the price of one.
Yeah, but you can do that without having the upside downness.
Oh, yes. But that's how they...
I think this question is to be answered.
I have a time theory.
2 front covers.
During the pandemic, I worked on transcribing military charts,
Yeah.
and a number of them would start, go about halfway through, and then flip. And I think it's ease of use. So when you're writing on a main ship, or you're holding it in the field, if you're holding all of the book, and you've got a few pages on one side,
Yeah.
and one on the other,
Yeah.
it's difficult to write on the last page.
Yeah.
And I wonder if holding those books as those, you have the same situation, not a bit of weight down.
Yeah. 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 Well, thank you both for those interesting calls.
These were simply to give you 2 stories for the price of one.
Yeah.
Short books for the troops.
Yeah. Yeah. Marvelous.
So thank you, Andrew. We had so many questions. I think we could keep you here all evening, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much.